welcome to the United Kingdom and the Ombudsman Office in the United Kingdom. We are really proud and privileged to be part of this great international world conference arranged with steel, grace and determination by Peter Tyndall and his team. I want to talk to you today about a study which we at PHSO, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, have done about what it's like for ombudsmen across the world to manage in the pandemic. And I'm pleased to say that this is a project which has been bought into by dozens of colleagues across the world who recognise the importance of us sharing views about how we can learn and develop from this chastening experience. Now, I'm no academic, but I do understand that in order to understand what needs are to develop an ombudsman scheme, there are 4 different elements. First of all, we have to understand what are called normative needs. That is the views of experts about, for example, what ombudsman schemes should be like. And we're privileged to have the Venice Principles to guide us as a benchmark for good practice for ombudsman schemes, adopted magnificently at the end of 2020 by the United Nations General Assembly. We also have express needs, which ombudsman schemes are particularly sensitive about. That is the view of complainants about their experience of using the scheme and how they think things should be better. And all of us pay great attention to that. Thirdly, there is comparative need, particularly important in the ombudsman world where there are lots of different schemes operating in national contexts. And here we want to compare what it's like in different countries dealing with roughly the same kinds of situations. And finally, magically, we need to take a grasp of what is called felt need. That is the views in this context of ombudsman leaders around the world about how they think things could be improved on the basis of their experience of dealing with the pandemic. So this is a study about learning. It's a study about colleagues operating in adversity. And it's something that we need to reflect on to make our institutions even more effective than they already are.
So Rob, I have 3 questions for you about the study. Can you tell us a bit about what the Ombudsman world was like in 2020?
Absolutely. In terms of the respondents to our questionnaire, most respondents were ombudsmen in national schemes. Most had been set up according to legislation or constitutional rules, and therefore they were in line with the principles of the Venice Principles, which is very important. 83% of all those who responded were also the accounting officers to Parliament, which is important because it puts an enormous pressure on ombudsman leaders, not only to be decision makers about cases, but to have responsibility for the financial control of the organisation. So that is a key issue. The schemes are not as small as sometimes we pretend. You know, most of the schemes employed staff of between 50 and 150 people. Most were established in the 20th century and a good number before 1980. So there is a strong contingent of well-established ombudsman schemes as well as the newer ones which came into place this century. And half of the respondents had been in office for 4 years or more. So this is not a terribly inexperienced group of people. They have been there for some time, they know what it's like, and that gives more authority to the scheme as well. The one concern I have is that about half of the respondents were appointed by open competition, but a fifth were appointed by invitation only. And that is a concern because it's contrary to the Venice principles that you should be appointed without there being an open competition. And I think we have a problem internationally if that 20% grows any larger in the coming couple of years.
I'm sure that's something people may want to ask about in the question and answer sessions.
Yeah.
Some concerns around that. I'm interested in the backgrounds, the educational and career backgrounds of the respondents to the survey.
Yeah, this is very interesting. What we discovered was that a vast majority of the respondents come to being ombudsman with a degree in legal studies. That may not be a great surprise to people in continental Europe. A smaller minority had social science degrees, but this has affected the careers that people have had before they became ombudsman. So we know that the vast majority of ombudsman leaders had a career in the legal services sector before they became ombudsman, and that is something that is interesting and needs probing, because we need to think about what message that sends out to the idea of the ombudsman as a discrete profession.
Okay, thanks. So that's really interesting. And finally, I'm interested in the gender split in respondents.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. 70% of all respondents are male. So there is a shortage of brilliant women ombudsmen, although the ones that are there are brilliant. And this has ramifications for the brand name, because a number of people said in our survey that they thought that the term ombudsman reflected gender bias. And the term ombudsman, although it's translated from the Norse literally, and therefore some people would say it doesn't have gender bias, it for a number of people it's the same as policeman or fireman. It should be taken out. And there are a number of schemes where the term ombudsman is not used at all. We have the term ombuds, we have defensor, we have public protector, we have human rights commissioner. So there are options if we don't want to use the term ombudsman, but that's a very sensitive issue.
And one that I'm sure will get plenty of debate in the conference. Thanks, Rob.
As far as ombudsman leaders are concerned, the greatest challenges to them and their schemes during the pandemic is set out in the chart which you can see on the screen now. There are lots of them, and here I can only focus on three. First of all, throughout the different countries, there is a common belief that we haven't yet got to a position where people understand exactly what it is that ombudsmen do. There's a lack of understanding about the ombudsman's role, and many people don't understand that it's not our job to be an advocate for individuals, but actually we have to be an advocate for fairness. We have to be impartial and professional. So this highlights the first of a number of ambiguities about the ombudsman's role. We have to be impartial and professional, but at the same time we have to be empathetic to complainants, understanding where they come from, and also understanding the key central fact that very often there is an imbalance of power between complainants who come to us and the bodies in jurisdiction who have many resources to field when dealing with complaints. So that is a big issue. The second big issue that comes out of the survey is that we are not yet good enough in meeting the expectations of our service users, and this is a continual struggle. We don't use simple language in explaining what it is we can do in an easily understandable way, and this has been made worse by the jargon of the pandemic. We're not terribly good, and I know this from looking around many countries, at reaching out to vulnerable communities. We too often deal effectively with articulate middle-class people, but dealing with communities who are vulnerable in terms of religion, being refugees, victims of violence, for example, we don't yet have a capacity to deal with that in a sufficiently rigorous way. And thirdly, and very important, we're not yet sufficiently coherent in how we deal with vexatious or unreasonable complainants, for fear that we might be getting in the way of justice when it comes to their cases. And the view that comes out from the survey is that we need to protect our own caseworkers just as much as we need to protect the integrity of complainants, because we can't have our own caseworkers intimidated, threatened or bullied. The third big issue that comes out is the issue of human rights. And I think that of all the subjects, well, this may not be the most important in terms of numbers. There are a number of schemes where the pandemic has led to a deterioration of human rights, as sometimes national governments have used the pandemic as a cover for taking rights away. And where this has happened is in countries like Kosovo, Indonesia, Mexico, Pakistan, Slovakia and Poland. There's a case study in the monograph from Pakistan where the Ombudsman notes that human rights abuses are wide-ranging and that children are at the centre of this, that there is a lack of respect for their education, there's too much child labour, there's forced child marriages, child trafficking, and juvenile justice is suboptimal. This is unacceptable. Where our brave and honourable colleague Adam Bodnar has stood against the ravages of the state in denying human rights to citizens across the board in the most honourable way, despite personal threats to him, despite intimidation. And I'm proud that we are on the same platform together today, and I'm also proud that the International Ombudsman Institute has not been slow in making sure that the Ombudsman is properly supported in his fight to ensure that everyone has a human right in Poland, not just a small number of people. So this is Parliament Square in London, and over there is Parliament, the House of Commons, the body to which I as Ombudsman have to give an account with scrutiny sessions and reports, which are always demanding and difficult to deliver. And here is Nelson Mandela, the person that we all have a responsibility to listen to in terms of his values and the skills that he brought to public policy. And if you look at the survey results on your screens, you'll see that there is a real challenge for all of us during the pandemic to deliver a number of key values and skills. One is about making our institutions accessible. Another is about making our institutions transparent. And a third critical issue is how do we make sure that we have the change management skills that we need to rescue our institutions when they get into trouble. Now, on accessibility, this is easier said than done. A number of our colleagues in the survey reported that if you have to work remotely and you already have a very small number of offices in diverse and big countries, it makes it very difficult for people to use your services. So in Indonesia, for example, they have a small number of offices for 250 million people. Even though they have 500 members of staff, there are 17,000 islands in Indonesia, which makes accessibility a real challenge for them. The same is true in places like Australia and New Zealand and certain parts of Central Europe, where there's a lack of access because of the lack of buildings, offices for ombudsmen to operate out of. That is why it's very important to look at the examples of the Netherlands, for example, which makes a good tradition of going out of the office, going to local cities where there isn't an ombudsman office and setting up stall in the square to encourage people to bring their complaints and to have discussions with the ombudsman in that way. And I think that's a very good principle. So you can see from the survey results that two of the key skills that ombudsmen say they need are, first of all, being an effective manager of change, and secondly, understanding the political scene. And most ombudsmen, more than half, say that being a change manager is a very difficult task given the multiple responsibilities that ombudsmen have. And here what we found was that, first of all, there's a political element to managing change which has to be, in a sense, discounted. Ombudsmen do not, largely speaking, they do not have binding powers. So we can't be judged in terms of the way in which recommendations are adopted if bodies in jurisdiction don't want to implement them. We don't have the power to do that. And secondly, our mandate is not in our hands. So the way we operate is determined by Parliament, not by our own management decisions. And that takes a lot of possibility out of our hands. But managing change internally is a challenge for all of us. And what the survey suggested was that while the civil service culture, which is the background of many ombudsman caseworkers, has merits in terms of experience and in terms of knowing how to work in a team, it also has its downside in that people tend to be or can be rule-bound and conservative in the way in which they approach their job, conservative with a small c. Secondly, as I said, many of the schemes are long-lived, and actually many case handlers are long-lived in the sense that they've worked for the Ombudsman Office for a long time. For the best of them, they bring the rich experience that goes with that. But some people, ombudsmen as well, become complacent, become hidebound, become resistant to change. And that needs a management response. That's not something that is inevitable in the scheme of things. What we discovered in the survey was that most promotion into management positions takes place as a result of people's skills in case handling. And that may be too narrow a base to promote people to deal with the management development issues that are necessary. As far as understanding the political scene is concerned, this varies from country to country. We know that in a lot of small jurisdictions, it's difficult because everybody knows everybody else. So the line between politicians and administrators is not quite as divorced as it would be in other scenarios. We also know that we have to be involved in politics because we're accountable to Parliament. But the trick, which is difficult in rocky political situations, is to be involved in politics on a non-party political level rather than a party political level. And I was struck by the Ombudsman of Victoria in Australia, who said that if you get too close to politics, you risk becoming part of the problem. And if you get too far from it, you are said not to understand it. And I think that is an ambiguity and a dilemma that needs managing and needs talking about. And I'm inviting everyone to come to Manchester to discuss this aspect of the Manchester Memorandum. And on that basis, I thank you and wish you well.